With the thunderous roar of cannons, the ground quaking under soldiers' boots, the Emperor of France, positioned at the center of the French lines, observed the battle with unyielding eyes. And on the fourth day of the Battle of Leipzig, at the Kingdom of Saxony in today's Germany, he ordered his troops to retreat. Chaotic and punctuated by the man's despair, the retreat was a bitter surrender to the inexorable declaration that the Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, had fallen. And this chronic on the Battle of Nations tells us the beginning of the fall of the image of Napoleon the Great, a figure that was seen as almost as undefeatable, implacable, or inevitable, almost as the new Alexander or Caesar, set to reconquer that which was forgot with the Greeks and Romans. Still, he was defeated, nevertheless. And across human history, over and over again, we are faced with this idea of a person, or moreover an institution, or even ideologies, in which is thought to last forever. But their eternity relies only on the books of history, for everything that is built by human hands tends to as well fall for the entropy of nature and the universe. For example, after the fall of the Catholic power in Europe, the only thing set to replace it was science, in which we ourselves nowadays takes it just like those before us thought on religion, on the church, on great figures and so on, as eternal. We put faith that this science will solve all of our problems, not only in the present, but as well as in the future. We think that this science will always serve us, always be there for us, always evolve and be the thing that we can all count on. And after the loss of the theological, animistic, and cosmological ways of thinking, that is, to believe that we are in a way all controlled by these superior beings or by spirits that surrounds us, just like we saw a while ago, we humans put our faiths in this new god called science and the institutions of academia or universities. But the first attempts to make a scientific way of thinking or just science were very unpolished. Some say that the alchemists were the first ones to try and to do something similar to explain the nature of things by systematic methodology and experimental approach, even though the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and also Greeks like Aristotle, Pythagoras, and many others were known to explain the world through the same lenses as well, or this scientific way. But still, their way of doing it was much more similar to that of the philosophers, rather than the concept of science we have today. It was only after figures like Galileo Galilei and Isaac Newton, who was also an alchemist, that science started taking a different path. People like Leonardo da Vinci, already in the 16th century, has written on his cynicism on topics like astrology, and stating that science was a better way of understanding the world instead. How cool is that? And you can read this on the Leonardo da Vinci autobiography by Walter Isaacson. But the point here is this. It was only at the end of the 19th century, in 1979, that these old concepts of psychology as something spiritual, animistic, and cosmological were set to end, or at least to be expanded to a more empirical, methodological, and experimental way of thinking and practicing, of course. It was with Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, the most Germanic name you will hear today probably, that psychology became a field of science, with Wundt being considered the father of experimental psychology, not Sigmund Freud, a common error that we will talk about later. But for now, at University of Leipzig in Germany, Wundt created the first formal laboratory for psychological research, as well as an academic journal known as Philosophische Studien, and then Psychologische Studien, in which he intended to publish the Institute's researches. And a tiny curiosity is that today, in 2024, this university still exists, which is not uncommon for universities in Europe. It is also one of the oldest universities in the world, being established in 1409. But the Institute for Psychology, founded by Wundt, is also still active today. And it was also one of the places in which I wanted to take a master's degree. Maybe I still can, who knows. But not much before Wundt, the field of psychology was already trying to make its first steps to the scientific field, with people making associations that our thoughts and behaviors and even our emotions were not related to gods or to our hearts, but rather to our brains. Then the reason why I'm telling all of this instead of talking about Wilhelm Wundt is because, differently from the other psychologists I intended to make video, Wundt didn't have a single corpus of theory like a Sigmund Freud, a Carl Jung, or many German philosophers before him. Instead, his single focus was to study psychology as a scientific field, inspired by the Illuminism and empiricism movements, and instead of the associations with theology, esotericism, metaphysical, and even rationalism. In fact, Wundt hated the rationalistic aspect of psychology. He didn't want this Platonism of accessing the knowledge through our minds. Instead, he wanted to test it, to prove it, to classify objectivity in the study of the psyche. But ironically, he was very critical of the categorization and the study of individual functions of the human psyche without realizing its interactions. For example, in a book called An Introduction to Psychology, he criticized the fact that many psychologists tended to analyze very specific functions of the human soul without realizing the influence of others. For example, studying reaction time, a very common thing on his time, without realizing the individual's attention, memory, and even consciousness state of mind and its interaction with each other. For today, we can even add the influences of the body on this, because we know that the brain, in the more experimental psychology, is in fact very important to our cognitive processes. Things we eat, the way we sleep, or the time we sleep, the clarity of the day, and so on, all of these biological and environmental things have great effects and impacts in our cognition, our emotions, and of course our behaviors as well. And the idea for Wundt in this book was just to say that these functions are all intertwined, happening at the same moment. So trying to study a single function will be something not as objective as one might think, once you don't take all of these variations into consideration. But at the same time, he quotes, "Nothing would promote the degeneration of psychology to a mere craftsmanship more than its segregation from philosophy." So even though he wanted to distance psychology from this more interpretationist part of science, he still saw that philosophy was still a ground, not only for psychology, but also for most sciences. And this is when we entered to another part of psychology, because at the same time, Wundt was creating experiments on his laboratory. Another person very close to Germany was also conducting experiments on his clinic. But instead of trying to categorize through practical scientific tests, he was more on another part neglected by Wundt. He was more on the theoretical and analytic part of psychology, being also remembered more than Wundt himself, and for some, even being considered the true father of modern psychology, or psychology as a field. In another video, we will talk more about Sigmund Freud and his contributions and discoveries to psychology.